So in the last video, we were looking at the single drop rule and how this kind of absolutist legal distinction about race identity was established. And some of you may know, this is when the Nazis were looking at how to establish distinctions between their Jewish communities and the mainstream German community. And it was a very similar situation. There was a lot of intermixing. And in that case, it was even harder because the differences in physiological type just weren't that great. But when the Nazis heard about this idea of, okay, only a single drop, only a one ancestor, a distant ancestor is what classifies you as black or would classify someone as Jewish, they just thought it was absolutely ridiculous. There was way too strict a guideline to do it. Now, the question here is, okay, well, how does this actually work when it comes to the way that society was structured? So if you look at this in the registration of birth and color in Virginia, it spells it out at the bottom. White person is one with no trace whatever of blood of another race, except that one with 1/16 of the blood of an American Indian, unmixed with other race, may be classed as white. So no trace whatsoever, right? That was the standard. Now, how do you're obviously not going to be traveling around necessarily with a registration of birth and color card. Many people didn't. The people who did have these were usually you would have your papers if you were free. You might carry something like this if you were traveling as a white servant of some kind. But again, if you look at the way that the society was actually structured, you had many different hues of people. So, and these were terms that were used at the time. And this is interesting about, well, who's black and who isn't. These words, octoroon, so 1/8 black, quadroon, 1/4 black, mulatto, biracial. And then the concept Creole really didn't even refer to skin color, it referred to your ethnic background. So Creoles were African Americans of French descent. So they spoke French. Or they spoke a Creole variant of it. Their culture was different. They gravitated towards the French identity, and so again, they would say, well, I'm not African American, I'm Creole. There was a difference there. So there was a cultural definition within the black community, and then there were all these different ways in which blackness was expressed in the way that people actually looked, and so. Obviously, in families, most African American families had white blood in them, either forced into them or because of earlier family connections pre-slavery. And so, what this means is that most black people in the United States, compared to Africa, they go to Africa, they look white. Langston Hughes, when he goes to Africa in the 20s. When he says he's black, they laugh at him. They say, "Look at you! You're not black. You're white." And so this whole idea of what classifies as race is very much about where you live, with whom you live, and whether or not people view you as that. So what's fascinating about this is you can see from the person who's a quarter black in the upper right there, she could very easily be Sicilian or of Russian heritage. It's going to get very confusing here about how you police this and how you identify. And of course, there are going to be a lot of people that are going to be passing too. So when you think about this idea of passing, you see these are black people who choose to, in many cases, their parents choose this for them. They're because of the advantages that you get in terms of class, in terms of racial identity, and in terms of economic opportunities and even property, you see this either African Americans identifying as white and passing meaning they're living in white communities and not saying anything about their identity, and people just assume that they're white because they have they check all the boxes. So if you look at this is Dr. Albert Johnson and the Johnson family, and they were living in Keene, New Hampshire. And he decided that he was not going to say anything about his identity because he was practicing medicine, and that was excluded to black people initially. Or at least he didn't think it would help his clientele, so it'd help his business, and he was also a civic leader. And it wasn't until after he established himself that he basically came out of the closet and said, well, actually, my family and I identify as black. And this made national news. It was a big deal. It's also important in this concept of being chosen exiles by identifying as white, you obviously cut yourself off from your blackness. So in this kind of dichotomy of racial identity in this caste system where blackness is one thing and whiteness is another thing, obviously it's way more complex and nuanced than that, but the system doesn't allow for that. So moving towards blackness or moving away from blackness and towards whiteness gives privileges, but also distances you because you can't really see your family and you can't identify with them in the same way. And it creates a kind of a cultural and social isolation for many people. And there are a lot of stories about this that are quite interesting. Now, another example of this, again, those of you who've studied Plessy versus Ferguson, this sometimes gets lost in the story because Homer Plessy was he was a Creole. And the reason that he was chosen as a test case was because he could pass. And the only reason that he is asked to leave the cable car is because he basically says, I'm actually a black person. But he's not just black, he's also Creole. So he falls into this third category, which doesn't have any definition in the law. They're only looking at it in terms of race. As you can see from his dress, he's dressed as an upper class citizen. He himself had status. He was solidly middle class. He was the type of person that would go and attend the opera and listen to classical music. And these were sort of culturally white things to do, white in quotation marks. But in part, the whole idea was when you're challenging segregation, you want to go with the ridiculousness of this sort of black-white division. Now, going back a little bit more into time, if you look at sort of how this worked on the plantation, as most of you know, Thomas Jefferson had a long-standing affair with Sally Hemings. He had 6 children by her. And what's fascinating about this is that when Jefferson's wife died, he vowed he would never get married again. But when he saw Sally Hemings, who was actually the daughter of his father-in-law, so again, the half-sister of his dead wife, she was apparently the spitting image of his wife, except she was darker skinned. And as you can see, because Sally Hemings herself was of mixed race background, she could pass, except she couldn't pass on the plantation because everybody knew because she was an enslaved person, she couldn't pass. However, when Thomas Jefferson goes to France and he's living in his apartment in France, there Sally Hemings is by his side. He introduces her in certain social circles in France as Mrs. Jefferson. Everybody understands that she's his mistress, but there's the whole idea of where she is in terms of her servitude. It gets much more softened by the cultural context of the French environment. It isn't until they come back. So she's enslaved the whole time, but her treatment in France is one thing. And then he comes back to the United States, and then she is forced to live in a separate part of the house. He and she want to make sure. I'm not sure she wants to. I think she probably would have preferred to keep it the way it was in France. But I think the idea is that it's the social context that creates the nature of the relationship. Now, this idea of oppression of Black people gets much more harsh and specific when you begin to look at enforcement. So beginning with the institution of slavery, moving into Jim Crow and the lynching traditions, and then of course with modern policing. And I'm sorry to show you that's disturbing picture of the murder of George Floyd, the lynching of George Floyd, really, if you want to look at it that way, because it does follow all of the law enforcement shown on video, to make a point about the role of white versus black people. So this idea of regulating Negro insolence and insubordination. So enforcing behaviors. The reason that man on the left is so badly whipped and scarred is because he's continually talking back to his master. He is running away. He is not. He is actively challenging the system. And what happens when you challenge the system is you get beaten or you get killed. The types of things that could get you lynched in the early 20th century, looking someone in the eye, a black person looking a white person in the eye, not showing respect, the certain amount of respect that was needed. A black man that would bump into a white woman was putting himself at risk. And then, of course, if you look at modern policing, this whole idea of resisting arrest, right? This idea, almost always the idea is, well, the defense for the police is, well, there was resistance of arrest, either someone running away, again, not showing proper deference to the authority. So this deeply ingrains both what whites expect of blacks and what blacks expect of whites who have power and control over them. So as this begins to get more, so we have it behaviorally being reinforced through the systems of white power and authority, but we also have it again in the science. We saw this a little bit earlier in the last video, but as we move towards this idea of racial purity in science, we also get the concept of eugenics. And eugenics is this idea that you can breed people like you can breed animals. So that wasps and those sort of that were seen as sort of at the top of the racial hierarchy should only have relationships with other people of that background, and those of darker skin identities, whether they be immigrants or black people, shouldn't have children at all. So interestingly enough, the original birth control movement, Margaret Sanger, was not directed at middle-class white women who were being encouraged to have more children. It was being directed towards primarily immigrants and in some cases even black people. So trying to control the system of racial propagation going forward. Now this got really disturbing if you look at how race was presented in popular culture. This comes from a Coney Island. These were called the Coney Island Pygmies. They were actually brought in from Africa, and they had their own village. They were really effectively enslaved. They were imprisoned in this in this exhibit, and white people would come and watch them, cooking around a fire, raising their children. It was, literally, it was this sort of exotic display of blackness and primitiveness. As part of a show that you could go to an amusement park. It's unbelievable and disgraceful, but again, culturally acceptable. The other thing that happened was with this idea of feeble-mindedness, that IQ and testing, which was totally culturally determined. This actually, the SAT dates back to this, which is interesting too, this whole idea of intelligence, which of course intelligence always has a cultural element to it, and what's being valued and what isn't. But if you were feeble-minded, you could be sterilized. And of course, the people who were determined to be feeble-minded were most frequently black or darker skinned white people. And you begin to see the eugenics and the birth control movement moving side by side in this way. So if you look at this in terms of sterilization, also they were literally taking out the uteruses of black women, extraordinarily coercive forms of racial control in the 1920s and 30s. This was done very much in secret. And finally, you have the anti-miscegenation laws stopping blacks and whites from marrying each other. And I don't have time to tell you the story, but let's just say these were on the books legally all the way until 1967, which is only 2 generations ago.